Random Thoughts. In this video, I'm going to read a part of Sir Charles Eliot's book, The East Africa Protectorate, where he tries to speculate on where the animals that are found in East Africa came from. Now, the East Africa Protectorate is a very interesting book, and this is a book that Sir Charles Eliot had published in 1905. Now, Sir Charles Eliot was the Commissioner of British East Africa, and he was the highest-ranking British official in the land that was known as the East Africa Protectorate. And this is the land that later on became the Kenyan colony, and of course later on became the Republic of Kenya. Now, Sir Charles Eliot wrote this book. It's a very comprehensive book, and he discusses many topics. He discusses the history of the land, the people, the climate, the potential of the land, the administrative issues. He discusses the budget, the economy, slave trade and commerce and all. He discusses very many things in the book. There is a chapter about the game or the animal, the wild animals on the land. And when you read these old documents about Kenya, you realize that one of the things that the British found to be very interesting about the land is the abundance of wild animals. And I saw this in Richard Maina Sagen's diary, where he discusses the animals, the wild animals, the game as they call it. And to them, this was very interesting. And the abundance of these wild animals is something that they found to be very intriguing. And of course, they engaged in hunting and such kind of stuff. And the way they describe it, both Richard Maynard Sagen and Sir Charles Eliot, seems like this animal was so many, especially when you traveled from Mombasa all the way to Nairobi and then the Rift Valley. These wild animals were so many: the gazelles, the antelopes, the buffaloes, the elephants, the giraffes, the zebras, the baboons. All these animals filled the land. And of course, today, if you go, for example, to Amboseli or you go to Savo, these animals still exist there. So this was very interesting to the Europeans. Now, Sir Charles Eliot tries to explain where these animals came from. And I found it so interesting that one of the theories that he puts forward is that these animals came from Europe. And that was like, is he trying to mean the beauty of these animals was so great to be indigenous to the land? Is that what he was trying to say? Or he was just trying to speculate? Of course, today, very few, I've not read anywhere where anybody has made the claim that the wild animals we see in Kenya and Tanzania today, and maybe Zambia and Zimbabwe, that these animals came from Europe. Everybody kind of takes it for granted that they're indigenous, they belong to this land. I'm going to read that part of the book. This is what he says. The explanation of the zoological distributions are peculiarly speculative and therefore changeable. In order to account for the habitat of the existing fauna of the world, naturalists have turned to the ocean into dry land and submerged or fished up continents and islands as often as suited their theories. The main facts connected with the Ethiopian regions. Now, when he used the word Ethiopian regions here, he's talking of a certain land that was considered to be full of wild animals. And in fact, it includes some parts of what we know today as Asia, and of course, the land we know as Ethiopia, the entire Horn of Africa, and Kenya, and some part Tanzania, and some other parts. So that word there is used to cover a very large area. It's not just Ethiopia as we know it today. And he continues to say, with the Ethiopian regions that are its fauna's present marked resemblance to that of Southeastern Asia, as for instance the presence in both the lion, elephant, and the rhinoceros, and marked in differences from that of Madagascar. The idea that there was once a continent where is now the Indian Ocean seems to be abandoned, and the hypothesis now in favor to explain the above coincidences and differences are two. The first, that equatorial Africa was the center where many prominent types, particularly the larger ungulata, were developed and whence they radiated. And the second, the exact opposite, namely that these forms were originally developed in Europe or Asia and penetrated to equatorial Africa, where owing to their being relatively unmolested by man, they survived longer and in greater numbers. This latter theory was originated by Huxley, who had not before him all the data now available, but saw his way to his conclusions with the provisions of genius and the tendency of the most recent biological research, influenced especially by the discovery of various extinct mammals in the Libyan desert, is to revert to it rather than to the hypothesis of equatorial origin. It is in fact thought that there are only three primary zoological regions: Australia, South America, and the third comprising of Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America. In this latter region, the original productive center was in the northern rather than in the southern hemisphere, and the peculiar fauna of Madagascar is explained on the supposition that it had already been severed from the mainland when the larger apes, carnivores, and ungulata migrated into Africa. So he talks about some other guy who came up with this theory. Of course, he says there are two theories, two primary theories as to the origin of the animals on the land, especially the hoofed mammals. And one is that they are indigenous of the land, and the other one is that they came from elsewhere, most likely the northern hemisphere and Europe, and they came downwards. And he said the evidence to prove that the latter is the way these animals found their way here is that they are not found in Madagascar, which is thought to have been part of Africa at some point. And the argument is that if the animals are indigenous of Africa, then they should be found in Madagascar, to mean that when the Madagascar broke away, it should have broken away with some of these animals. But these animals are not in Madagascar. So they came to the conclusion that because of that, these animals were not always on the land. They came from elsewhere. And so by the time they are coming to the land, Madagascar had already been cut off from the mainland. Now, that theory, of course, can be challenged, of course, because what if Madagascar broke away long before these animals existed anywhere on Earth? There is that possibility. So there are so many things that are possible. So I found this theory to be very interesting. Seems like Sir Charles Eliot was not really pushing it, or he was trying to hide behind somebody else. This guy who he calls Huxley, who is like somebody who was a zoologist or something of that kind. So I found that argument to be very interesting, and this argument will be more. It becomes more important when you understand how the British and the Europeans in general found the wild game to be so interesting to them. It will make a lot of sense because to them, the wild animals made this land to be even more beautiful. In fact, I think in some parts of Richard Maynard Sagen diary, he basically describes this land as the Garden of Eden, basically going by the different plants and animals and, that existed on the land. It was such a unique land, full of life, and it was not similar to many other parts of the world. Those are my random thoughts.